They say your home is where your heart is, but what happens when the heart that made that home is told it doesn't belong anymore? I never imagined the day would come when my own son, the boy I carried through storms, whose scraped knees I kissed, whose dreams I fed before I ever dared feed my own, would look me in the eye and scream words so sharp they nearly stopped my breath. You don't live here anymore. It wasn't just a sentence. It was an erasure, a rejection not just of my presence, but of everything I had ever given him. And in that moment something inside me didn't just break. It woke up. My name is Miriam, and if you've ever given your whole soul to someone who later acted like you were just in the way, you'll understand why I couldn't just walk away silently. What my son didn't realize is that my silence all those years wasn't weakness. It was love. But when he tried to push me out of the very life I built for him, he unleashed a reply that made him regret everything. If you stay with me until the end, you'll understand why I stood tall. Because dignity never needs permission to speak. It happened on a Sunday, one of those gray, windless days when the world feels paused and fragile, and I remember it vividly not because of the weather or what I was wearing, but because of the way my son's voice echoed through the house like a gunshot, loud, sharp, final, as he stood at the top of the stairs with his face red and his hands clenched into fists and screamed, "You don't live here anymore." And in that moment something inside me collapsed like a load-bearing wall pulled out from the center of a house, and I just stood there frozen holding a basket of clean laundry, socks still warm from the dryer, as if they mattered anymore, as if the folding of clothes could tether me to a life that had just slipped out from under my feet. And my heart thudded in my chest so loudly I could barely hear his next words. Something about me overstepping, about Alana needing space, about this being his house now. And I watched his mouth move, but I didn't respond because I was too busy trying to piece together how we had gotten here, how the boy who used to beg me to tuck him in and whisper bedtime stories had turned into a man who looked at me like I was an intruder in the very space I had helped him build. Me, the woman who had co-signed the mortgage when the bank wouldn't trust a first-time buyer, who had emptied out her emergency fund to help cover the closing costs, who had cleaned every inch of this house with her own hands before the movers arrived, who had brought groceries and extra linens and cooked meals for his freezer the first few weeks he moved in, who had made it a home, and now he stood there, eyes cold, body rigid, telling me I didn't belong. And as the silence stretched, I saw the hallway behind him, the one-eyed hung photos in just months ago, now empty of every frame, and the sting of that emptiness hit harder than his words because it wasn't just what he said, it was everything that had already been done, the decisions made in my absence, the rooms rearranged as if erasing my presence piece by piece until I was no longer welcome, and I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand that he look at me and remember who I was, what I had done, how I had scraped and worked and sacrificed so he could even stand there in that house with that pride in his chest. But I didn't. I just stood there, a basket of laundry in my arms and a weight 10 times heavier, pressing down on my ribs, and I nodded not because I agreed but because I needed to breathe, and I walked out, each step feeling like betrayal, not of him but of myself, of every instinct that told me to stay, to fight, to plead, but something deeper told me that wasn't the way, not anymore. And as the door shut behind me I felt like a stranger on my own doorstep, the wind catching the edge of my coat like the breath of something I couldn't see but could feel deeply, painfully, and the tears didn't come right away, not until I reached the car and sat in the driver's seat with the engine off and my hands gripping the wheel like it was the only solid thing left, and I let the tears fall silently, not out of weakness but because when you carry love as long and as hard as I have, the breaking of it is not loud, it's quiet, devastatingly quiet, and I drove away with no destination, no plan, just a numbness that sat like ice in my veins as memories played uninvited in my mind. Birthday parties with paper hats and frosting on cheeks, school mornings with rushed lunches and forgotten permission slips, late nights with fevers and whispered lullabies, the time he broke his arm and wouldn't stop crying until I held him and said, "I've got you," over and over, and now he'd pushed me out like a houseguest who overstayed her welcome, and the pain wasn't just in the rejection, it was in the realization that he didn't see me anymore, not the way he used to, not the way I still saw him. And I wondered as I drove aimlessly through the streets we used to walk together, if I had missed the signs, if I had loved him so much that I hadn't noticed when that love turned into something he resented. And I thought of Alana, so poised, so controlled, always smiling with her eyes but never with her heart. And I wondered if she had planted the seed, if she had watered his doubts until they grew into walls between us. And maybe that's what hurt the most, that someone else could look at everything I had given, everything I had built, and see it as clutter, as overbearing, as a threat, and that my son would believe her, would choose her perception over the truth of our years together, And I pulled over finally into a parking lot outside a closed library, and I sat there for a long time, letting the cold seep in through the windows as I stared at nothing, and in that nothingness, I realized something that made my chest ache in a new way. Not everything you build is yours to keep. Not every heart you raise will remember the hands that held it, and sometimes, the very love you give can be used to push you away, to make you feel like you've overstayed your welcome in a story you wrote with your own blood. And I didn't know then what I would do next, but I knew one thing with perfect clarity. I was done begging to be seen. Before I was the woman standing at a doorstep told she no longer belonged, I was the girl sitting in a hospital bed with trembling hands, holding a swaddled infant I wasn't sure I was strong enough to raise. And yet the moment his tiny fingers wrapped around mine, something in me shifted. A quiet, fierce knowing that no matter what life took from me, I would never let it take from him, and from that moment on, every breath I took was for my son, every choice filtered through the lens of his safety, his joy, his future, and it wasn't a fairy tale. Not even close. I was 21, newly single after his father vanished the day I told him I was pregnant, living in a rented basement with damp floors and moldy corners, working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, and every day was a balancing act between survival and motherhood, between exhaustion and the illusion of normalcy I fought to create for Ethan, and I remember the way my feet ached during those long night shifts cleaning offices, the burn in my shoulders from hauling crates in the morning stockroom, the shame of waiting in food pantry lines with a baby in my arms, pretending not to notice the way people stared like I was just another cautionary tale. And yet every time I walked through that door and saw Ethan's gummy smile, it felt worth it. It felt like I had purpose, like I was building something no one could take from us. And even in the worst of it, when I sold my grandmother's ring to pay the heating bill, when I ate crackers for dinner so he could have a proper meal, when I spent Christmas Eve sewing together stuffed animals from old socks because I couldn't afford gifts, I never let him feel poor, never let him know just how close we were to losing everything, because that was the point of motherhood to me, not just loving but shielding, absorbing the world's harshness so your child never had to taste it too soon. And the years blurred into one another, first steps and first fevers, scraped knees in emergency rooms, school projects and forgotten field trips, and I was always there, present, working, praying, budgeting down to the last cent, and somehow slowly we moved up. From the basement to a small apartment, then to a slightly better one, and I remember the pride I felt the first time I bought a used car with cash, not because it was flashy, but because it meant I could take him to school on rainy days instead of dragging him across town in soaked shoes. And Ethan, he was a bright, curious child, always asking questions, always holding my hand too tight in crowds, and even though I was tired beyond words most of the time, I never missed a single parent-teacher night, never forgot to bake cupcakes for his birthday even when it meant staying up until 2 a.m. after a double shift, because I needed him to know he was wanted, chosen, treasured. And as he grew older, I started to feel like maybe the hardest part was behind us. He got into a good college, the first in our family, and I remember sitting on the edge of my bed after getting his acceptance letter in the mail, clutching it like it was a miracle, and crying until my chest hurt because I had done it. I had raised a boy who was going to make it, who wasn't going to be a statistic, and I worked even harder then, taking on extra shifts so I could help with tuition, skipping my own dental appointments to make sure he had what he needed. And I never asked for thanks, never expected anything in return, because my reward was watching him grow, watching him walk across that graduation stage, tall and confident in his cap and gown, while I sat in the crowd, tears running down my face, knowing every sleepless night, every sacrifice had brought us to that moment. But what I didn't realize was that while I had been giving him everything, I had slowly been giving up parts of myself too, dreams I had shelved, relationships I let wither, hobbies I never touched again because there simply wasn't room for them in a life built around survival. And in doing so, maybe I taught him that my role in life was only to serve, to give, to provide, and never to need. And that realization now, after being told I no longer belonged in the very life I had carved out with blistered hands and borrowed time, was like a dagger, because love should never be invisible, but somehow mine had become just that, a silent force holding up walls he no longer saw. And maybe that's why it hurt so much, why his words didn't just wound, they collapsed a lifetime of labor, because I had believed, foolishly perhaps, that the love I gave would be enough to keep me from being pushed out like an old coat no longer in season. And yet here I was, looking back at every milestone, every late-night math session, every illness soothed with damp cloths and whispered lullabies, and wondering if it had all just been forgotten, buried beneath the new life he was building, a life that no longer had space for me. And I sat with that grief, let it wash over me like a tide I couldn't resist, because it was real and deep and earned, and as I stared at the ceiling that night in a small motel room I'd booked with what little savings I had left, I thought to myself, not with bitterness but with clarity, that I had given everything to raise him, but I had nothing left to give now, not because I didn't love him, but because I had finally realized that love, to be real, must also include love for oneself. The distance didn't come all at once. It crept in quietly like a draft slipping through a cracked window on a warm day, subtle enough to ignore until one day you find yourself shivering and unsure when the temperature changed. And I can't even pinpoint the exact moment when Ethan started pulling away, but I remember the signs in hindsight, like breadcrumbs I had been too tired or too hopeful to follow. The way he stopped calling me just to talk, how our phone conversations became shorter, filled with long pauses and vague answers, how his "I love yous" faded from habit to obligation to silence, and I remember thinking maybe it was just the natural progression of growing up, of a young man stepping into his independence, because isn't that what every parent wants? To raise a child who can stand on their own, make decisions, carve out their place in the world? But what I hadn't prepared for, what no one tells you about, was how easily independence can twist into detachment, how the hands you once held so tightly could learn not just to let go but to push you away entirely. And there were moments, small and sharp, that I now recognize as the turning points. The first time he forgot my birthday and offered a half-hearted apology 2 days later. The Thanksgiving when he didn't come home but posted pictures at Alana's parents' house with a plate full of food and a smile that looked rehearsed. The time he asked me to stop dropping by, unannounced, even though I had only ever done it to leave him meals or bring him clean laundry when he was too busy to do it himself. And I told myself it was okay, that he was just overwhelmed, that Alana's influence wasn't negative, just different. But the truth is, there's a look people give you when they've outgrown you, a certain politeness that feels like distance draped in civility, and I saw that look in Ethan's eyes long before he ever raised his voice, long before he stood at the top of the stairs and stripped me of my place in his life with one sentence. And as I think back now, I remember a night we spent watching old home videos together, maybe 2 years ago when he was still in college. He had come home for the weekend and we were laughing at his toddler self dancing in a Superman cape, and I reached over and tousled his hair without thinking, the way I used to when he was small, and he gently pulled away and said, "Mom, don't," not unkindly but with a finality that made my hand fall back into my lap like it no longer knew where it belonged. And that night I cried in the shower, not because he had hurt me but because I knew deep down that something precious had begun to slip away, and I didn't know how to hold on to it without smothering it, so I did what I always did. I stepped back, gave him space, told myself this was just part of the process, that if I kept loving him gently from a distance he'd come back on his own. But the distance only grew, fed not by malice but by convenience, by comfort, by the allure of a life where I wasn't necessary anymore. And I felt it most acutely in the way Alana spoke to me. Always respectful, always smiling, but with a tone that said, "Thank you for what you've done, now please don't linger." And I tried, truly I did, to give them room to grow as a couple, to show up with kindness and not expectation, but every time I sat on their couch I felt like a relic from another time, something to be politely acknowledged and then set aside, and slowly I began to find excuses not to visit, not because I didn't want to see him, but because I couldn't bear the weight of being unwanted. And when he stopped asking about my life, about my job, my health, the things I once loved but had long since put away, I realized he no longer saw me as a person, just a figure in his past, someone who had served her role and was now supposed to fade quietly into the background. And I think that's what hurts more than anything. The idea that I became invisible to him while still standing right there, holding out love like an offering he no longer needed. And I wonder now if the space he created wasn't just physical but emotional, a gradual erasure of the bond that had once defined us. And I think back to the way he used to call me Mama in his sleep when he was little, how he used to cry when I dropped him off at school, and how I'd sit in the parking lot for 15 minutes just to make sure he was okay. And it's hard not to feel like that little boy died somewhere along the way, replaced by a man who thinks strength means shutting people out, who thinks autonomy means silence. And I don't know if it's my failure or just the way the world teaches young men to forget the hands that raised them, but I do know this. I would have walked through fire for him, and now I can't even cross his threshold without being reminded that I'm no longer welcome. And that kind of distance doesn't just break your heart. It makes you question if you ever really belonged at all. It started with little things, subtle cues that might have seemed harmless to anyone else but to me felt like cracks forming beneath the surface of something once sacred. Like the day I walked into Ethan's house carrying a casserole dish I'd spent the morning preparing, my arms full and heart open. only to find the guest bedroom where I used to stay painted over, my blanket and pillow gone, the small framed photo of us at his high school graduation no longer on the dresser but replaced with a decorative mirror, and when I asked if the picture had broken, Alana smiled too brightly and said they were streamlining the aesthetic, and the way she said it, cheerful and dismissive, made my throat tighten because I knew what she meant even if she didn't say it. My presence didn't fit their style anymore and I laughed it off because that's what I'd trained myself to do, to pretend things didn't sting when they did, but I felt the chill in my chest as I carried that casserole into a kitchen where nothing I'd once helped organize remained, where the magnet I gave Ethan that said "call your mom" had disappeared from the fridge, and my casserole sat untouched at the edge of the counter while a sleek charcuterie board occupied the center. And no one mentioned it again that night. After that, the boundaries became more obvious. Like invisible fences built with smiling faces and tight polite nods. Alana asking gently but firmly if I could text before visiting instead of just showing up. Ethan asking if I could, maybe tone it down, when I brought up family traditions or old stories in front of their friends, like the one about how he used to dress up the dog for Halloween and make me take pictures, and each time I obliged I felt myself shrinking, adjusting, pulling my warmth in like it was offensive, and still I told myself this was normal, that all families go through seasons, that maybe I was overreacting until one evening I arrived with a bag of groceries. Things I knew Ethan liked because I'd bought them for years, favorite soups and snacks he used to beg for. And as I placed the bag on the counter, Alana looked at it and said, "Oh, that's sweet, but we're trying to eat clean now." And the look Ethan gave her wasn't one of frustration but agreement, like I had brought something embarrassing into their world, and I stood there nodding, pretending it didn't cut me, and quietly took the bag back to the car. And later that night I found myself parked down the street with the engine off, my hands gripping the wheel and the tears falling silently, not because I'd been turned away, but because I had finally admitted to myself that I was no longer welcome, that the house I had helped them move into, cleaned for, cooked in, cried in when Ethan was too sick to stand, was no longer a place I could rest my heart. And I thought about how walls are meant to shelter, to hold memories, to make you feel safe, but these walls had become something else entirely, polished, curated, sealed, and as much as I wanted to believe there was still a place for me inside them, the truth was unavoidable. I was now just a visitor, one who had to earn her entry, one whose welcome was always time-limited and contingent on silence, on not bringing too much of herself inside, and that realization, quiet and brutal, stayed with me in every interaction, every birthday invitation that came too late, every holiday suggestion that I join for dessert instead of dinner. And still I tried, still I showed up with gifts wrapped in care, with compliments on the decor, with stories carefully filtered to avoid making anyone uncomfortable, and each time I left that house I carried a little less of myself with me, like I was slowly eroding under the weight of their approval. And the worst part was watching Ethan go along with it, watching him pretend not to see how his silence hurt me, how his avoidance spoke louder than any confrontation could. And I realized one night as I sat in my quiet apartment surrounded by boxes I hadn't unpacked since the last time I moved to be closer to him, that love, when not nurtured, turns into longing, and longing, when ignored, turns into grief. And I was grieving a relationship I hadn't even allowed myself to admit was dying, because I couldn't face the fact that the child I had once carried through every storm had built a life with no door left open for me. That it happened by accident. The kind of accident that only fate could orchestrate, subtle and cruel and completely irreversible. And it began the morning I returned to the house. Yes, his house now, though that word still caught in my throat like a thorn, because Ethan had called to say I'd left a few old files in the garage storage cabinets and Alana wanted them cleared out, just in case they needed the space. And I'd said I'd be by early, before they got home from a weekend trip, because it was easier that way, cleaner. And I arrived just as the sun was breaking through the clouds, its weak light filtering through the front windows as I stepped into a space that used to feel like mine. And I moved through the garage with deliberate calm, sorting through boxes of tools, school papers, and knickknacks that held pieces of a life Ethan clearly no longer had use for, until I found one small cardboard box shoved behind a stack of holiday bins labeled Mom. And for a moment I froze because I hadn't packed anything labeled that, and as I pulled the box forward, dust clinging to the flaps, I felt the weight of something different inside, something heavy not in size but in implication. And when I opened it, what I found wasn't mine. It was a collection of papers, envelopes, old letters, and what looked like medical forms bound in a manila folder marked Confidential HD. And my breath caught because those were my initials, and as I pulled the folder out and sat on the concrete floor, my hands trembling, I began to read. and what I saw unraveled me piece by piece, letter by letter, revelation by revelation, until the woman who had walked into that garage believing she had simply been discarded by a thoughtless son now saw the darker truth hiding behind his indifference. Ethan had known for years, a secret I had spent a lifetime trying to protect him from, and he had kept it from me not out of kindness but for convenience, and suddenly memories began to rearrange themselves in my mind like a puzzle flipped face down and turned over again with fresh eyes. Because tucked inside that folder was a letter from his father. My ex, the man who disappeared when I was pregnant, the man Ethan had never known and who I had told him was better left forgotten. And the letter, postmarked 3 years ago, was addressed not to me but to Ethan, and it began with, "I know I wasn't there but I want you to understand why," and with every line the past I had buried clawed its way back to the surface. The addiction, the debt, the emotional abuse, the threats he made while I was pregnant, the night I ran from him with nothing but a duffel bag and a heart full of fear, determined to raise Ethan in a world without that darkness, and I realized then that Ethan had responded to the letter, had met him, had formed some kind of relationship, maybe brief, maybe ongoing. I didn't know, but what shattered me was that he never told me, not even when I asked directly years ago if he had ever heard from his father, and now, reading the exchanges printed and neatly stored away, I saw Ethan's handwriting, his questions, his anger, his need, and I also saw something else. Resentment, the kind that festers in silence, the kind that sees truth but interprets it without empathy. And in one letter Ethan wrote, "She always painted you as a ghost, but now I wonder if she was just trying to control the narrative to keep me close." And I felt like I had been stabbed because what I had done out of protection, out of necessity, had somehow become a weapon used against me, and I kept reading, numb, until I found the most recent piece. An email printed from Alana's account, sent to Ethan's father just 6 months ago with the subject line, "Update on the house situation," and as I read through it the words twisted inside me like a knife. She had been consulting him, or at least informing him about our finances, about Ethan's growing discomfort with his mother's involvement, about options to legally transition her out of any remaining claims, and that's when I understood, not just why I had been pushed out but how deeply I had been betrayed, not only by Ethan but by the silent hand of a man I had spent my life trying to protect him from. And I sat there in that garage, papers scattered around me, my fingers curled tightly around the letter Ethan never showed me, and I cried, not loud or fast, but the kind of crying that comes when your past, your present, and your illusions collapse all at once. And I knew with a clarity so brutal it nearly knocked the breath from my lungs, that the line Ethan screamed, "You don't live here anymore," had not come from nowhere. It had been built brick by stories I hadn't told and narratives someone else had twisted in my absence. And I felt the floor tilt beneath me, not literally but spiritually, because the foundation I thought we stood on was gone, replaced by assumptions, by manipulation, by a version of me I didn't even recognize. And in that moment, something inside me didn't just break. It burned, not with rage but with resolve, because I had stayed silent to keep him safe, and all it had done was make space for lies. And as I gathered those papers, placed them back in the box, and walked out of that garage into the bitter afternoon air, I made a promise to myself. Not to destroy Ethan, not to expose his father, but to reclaim the truth, to reclaim my story, because no one, no partner, no parent, no child, gets to rewrite your life without your voice. And I wasn't just going to sit quietly and be erased. It's strange how grief and revelation can ignite something inside you that had long been buried under the weight of endurance. How the same woman who once sat quietly in the background of her son's life, shrinking herself to keep the peace, can suddenly stand taller, speak louder, and remember that before she was a mother, she was a woman with a spine made of steel and a soul forged in fire. And in the days following the discovery in that garage, I found myself transforming, not overnight and not without pain, but deliberately, like shedding a skin I had outgrown decades ago without realizing it. And it began not with vengeance but with stillness, with sitting in my small apartment surrounded by boxes and fragments of a life I had once believed would always include my son, and staring at those letters, those documents, those echoes of betrayal. I allowed myself to feel everything, not just the heartbreak or the rage, but the deeper grief of disappearing from someone's life while you're still alive. And once the crying stopped, once the nausea and dizziness of realization passed, I stood up, made tea, and pulled out a yellow legal pad and began writing not a letter to Ethan but a list. A list of everything I had contributed, from the cosign on the mortgage to the furniture I had paid for, to the utility bills I covered for the first 6 months, to the renovations I had helped with, not just financially but physically. And line by line as I wrote, I felt the fog begin to lift and the helplessness replaced by clarity, because for so long I had told myself I didn't need recognition for what I gave, that love didn't keep score. But the truth is, when people begin to erase you, you must bring your own receipts. Not for revenge but for truth, and that's what this was now. A reckoning, not just with Ethan but with myself. With every moment I told myself to be small, to be silent, to be grateful for scraps of attention when I had fed people from an empty table and never once asked for anything in return. And the next day I made appointments. One with a real estate attorney who, after listening to my story and reviewing the documents, raised his eyebrows and said, "You're not powerless here." And something in me swelled at those words like a long dormant flame catching wind. And then with a financial advisor, who helped me understand how much of my own money had gone into that house and how it could be documented and leveraged if necessary. And I didn't tell Ethan I was doing this, didn't warn him or hint, because this wasn't about him anymore. This was about me, about reclaiming not just my place in that house but in my own life. And I began to wake earlier, sleep better, eat more deliberately. And every morning I looked in the mirror and reminded myself that the version of me who kept the lights on during the worst winters, who patched holes in jeans and in hearts, who held her child's hand through fever dreams and heartbreaks, had never gone away. She had just been waiting to be called back, and I called her with every breath, with every document filed, with every moment I said no when I once would have said yes. And even when fear crept in, because it always does, I remembered the woman who once walked into a courtroom alone to fight for custody, who once worked 3 jobs while studying for a bookkeeping certificate at night, and I said to myself, if you could do that, you can do this. And slowly strength replaced sorrow, and where there had once been confusion, now there was a plan. And it wasn't dramatic or destructive. It was surgical, precise, legally sound and emotionally grounded. And as I prepared each step, I began reaching out to people I hadn't spoken to in years. Old friends, coworkers, even my sister in Seattle whom I drifted from, and I let them in, shared what I was going through, and the outpouring of love I received reminded me that I was not alone, that my worth was not contingent on my role in my son's life, and that, perhaps, I had built too much of my identity around being needed by someone who no longer saw me, and now it was time to be needed by myself, to be seen by myself. And when I finally received confirmation that the documentation was in place to assert my financial interest in the house, I didn't feel smug or vindictive. I felt calm, anchored, ready, because this wasn't about kicking him out or proving a point. It was about finally speaking aloud a truth I had held in my bones for too long. That I mattered, that my love was not disposable, and that no one, not even the child I raised, could diminish the life I had built or the woman I had become. And I stood in that truth with a steadiness I hadn't known in years. And I was ready, not for confrontation but for clarity, not for shouting, but for being heard. Not as a mother begging for love, but as a woman reclaiming her worth. That I didn't knock. I used my key, the same one I hadn't returned, because deep down I always believed this house was as much mine as his. Not in ownership perhaps, but in origin, in effort, in the weight of every dollar, every choice, every scraped knuckle and sleepless night I'd poured into its foundation. And when I stepped inside that afternoon, it was silent, still, the kind of silence that settles after something irreversible has happened. And I stood there in the entryway for a moment, breathing in the scent of wood polish and a hint of lavender from one of Alana's reed diffusers, and I walked slowly, deliberately, past the living room where the throw pillows had been rearranged 100 times since I'd fluffed them for Ethan's first night there, and into the kitchen where light spilled through the windows and danced across the marble countertop I helped pick out when we still made decisions together. And I waited not long before he came down the stairs. His face was tight with confusion, then irritation, that look he got when things didn't fit into the version of the world he thought he controlled. And he asked, "Why are you here?" Not cruelly but without warmth, and I smiled, not because I felt joy but because I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, weeks rediscovering a voice I had once used to negotiate jobs, pay bills, protect a child and a household. And I said calmly, "We need to talk." And without waiting for permission, I sat at the table and placed the folder in front of me. The same one that had once lived in the back of a dusty garage box, now annotated, organized, legally validated. And I opened it slowly, giving him time to sit, which he did reluctantly. And I began, not with accusations but with facts, with dates and receipts, with timelines and bank statements, each one a stone in the road I had walked to help build his life. And his posture shifted as I spoke, his eyes narrowing, then widening, then blinking in confusion as the weight of what I was saying began to settle in. And I told him, clearly, without tremble or apology, that I was aware of the letters, of the meetings with his father, of the financial maneuvering behind my back, and I saw it then, the flush in his cheeks, the dart of his eyes, the way his fingers twitched against the table like he wanted to interrupt but didn't know how, and I paused only once to look at him fully, not as a mother pleading for recognition, but as a woman whose love had been taken for granted, and I said, "You told me I didn't live here anymore and I heard you, but what you didn't understand is that I was never trying to live in your house, I was trying to stay in your life." And that stopped him cold because for the first time he couldn't hide behind defensiveness or distance, and when he tried to explain, to blame Alana or confusion or stress, I held up my hand and said, "Don't, this isn't about them, it's about you and me and the choice you made to push me out." Without asking why I held on for so long, and I saw it then, the crack in his facade, the first flicker of something real breaking through, and I told him, not as a threat but as a declaration, that I had asserted my legal stake in the house, that the papers were filed and the transfer was pending, and for a moment he sat in stunned silence processing and then asked, "Are you taking it from me?" And I shook my head and said, "No, I'm taking back what's mine," and his shoulders dropped because he understood then that this wasn't revenge, it was reckoning, and I stood, leaving the folder on the table, and as I turned to leave he said quietly, "Why didn't you tell me about him? About what he did?" And I stopped, hand on the doorframe, and said, "Because I wanted you to grow up without shame, but I never expected you to grow up without gratitude." And then I walked out, not looking back, not because I didn't care, but because I had said everything I needed to say, not with rage or resentment, but with the quiet force of a woman who finally remembered that her worth didn't depend on anyone else's recognition of it. And for the first time in years, I felt not broken or begging, but whole. That he didn't realize it right away. At first, it was just silence that lingered in the house long after the door closed behind her. A silence that wasn't peaceful but echoing, accusatory, as if the walls themselves were remembering who built them, who cleaned them, who filled them with warmth when they were just newly painted emptiness. And Ethan sat at the kitchen table for a long time staring at the folder his mother had left behind. The documents neatly stacked, each one a reflection of her steady, quiet contributions over the years. Her name on the mortgage application, the bank transfers during the first 6 months when he struggled with payments, the text receipts of furniture purchases she made without ever being asked, just assuming he needed them, because that's who she was, always anticipating needs, always filling in the gaps before anyone noticed they were there. And now, in the deafening aftermath of her words, all he could hear was the sound of her voice, saying, "I was trying to stay in your life." And it repeated in his mind like a mantra twisted into a blade, and he felt it then, not just regret but shame, deep and cutting, the kind that makes your stomach knot and your face burn when you're alone and you realize you've not just made a mistake, you've wounded the one person who never asked for anything but to be loved, to be seen. And in the days that followed, everything began to unravel, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, cruelly. And it began with Alana, who, when he told her what had happened, didn't react with understanding but with thinly veiled frustration, asking questions like, "So what are we going to do now? And why didn't you tell me your mom still had leverage on the house?" And though her words weren't cruel, they were cold, clinical, the way someone speaks when they're more concerned about logistics than loss. And it made something in him recoil, because for the first time he saw the thread of control running through their dynamic, the subtle corrections, the disapproving glances whenever he mentioned a childhood story, the way she always spoke of building a future with him but never mentioned his past unless it was to reframe it. And now when she looked at him, it wasn't with empathy, it was with calculation, and the realization hit him like a slow tidal wave. He had chosen the approval of someone who didn't know his mother's sacrifices, didn't understand the years of struggle etched into every inch of her skin, over the unwavering love of the woman who had given him everything. And it was that night, as he sat alone in the living room with the lights off, the soft hum of the fridge in the background, that he finally began to feel the full weight of what he had done. He remembered the sound of her voice when he was sick as a child, the way she'd wrap him in blankets and stroke his hair until the fever passed, the long nights she stayed up editing his college essays, the way her eyes lit up when he got accepted. And now all of that felt distant, not because it had faded but because he had buried it under resentment he hadn't earned, under narratives fed by someone who never sat in his mother's shoes. And as the days turned into a week and the weeks turned into a month, the distance between him and Alana grew too, their conversations clipped, their silences heavier, until one night she simply said, "I don't think this is working anymore." and left, no tears, no begging, just an exit that felt more like a business transaction ending than a relationship dissolving. And strangely, he didn't stop her because by then he understood that what was falling apart wasn't just his relationship or his living situation. It was the illusion he had built around himself, the story that said he was self-made, that he had outgrown the need for his mother, that love could be conditional and still survive. And he began to walk through the house differently after that, slower, quieter, like a guest in his own home, and he started noticing the things he had overlooked before. The wear on the baseboard she once painted, the recipe cards still tucked in the kitchen drawer with her handwriting on the corners, the faint scent of cinnamon that lingered on a throw pillow she had crocheted, and every detail became a memory, and every memory became a wound, and in those quiet hours, he began to wonder if it was too late to mend what he had broken. Not the house, not the logistics, but the bond, the trust, the sacred thing that had lived between them all those years. And though he hadn't called her yet, hadn't texted or written, it wasn't because he didn't want to, it was because he didn't know what words would be enough, what gesture could make her believe he truly saw her now. And so he sat each night in the dim light of a home that no longer felt like his, waiting for the courage to reach across the chasm he had created, and knowing that whatever reply she gave, whether forgiveness or silence, it would be more than he deserved, because some things don't fall apart loudly, they unravel in the absence of love. And now he knew, he had let the one person who loved him purely walk away, and all he could do was hope she might still turn around. It was strange how quiet the house had become without anyone needing to ask him for anything, without laughter echoing from the other room, or the faint clatter of dishes as someone moved around the kitchen with a kind of peace that never had to be announced. It just was. And in that stillness, Ethan found himself face to face with something he had never allowed himself to sit with for too long. His own reflection, not in the mirror over the bathroom sink or the darkened screen of his phone, but in the choices he had made, the words he had spoken, the way he had looked his mother in the eye and spoken a sentence that could never be taken back. And though he had convinced himself at the time that he was asserting boundaries, creating space for adulthood, what he came to realize in the solitude that followed was that he had not been setting limits. He had been exiling the very person who had carried him through every storm of his life, and the realization was like peeling back layers of a wound he had convinced himself was healed, only to find it was still raw, still bleeding beneath the surface of pride. And each day he began to walk through memories, not with nostalgia but with honesty, replaying moments from his childhood with new eyes, remembering how his mother never missed a parent-teacher conference no matter how tired she was, how she used to write his name in Sharpie on everything he owned because she was so terrified he'd lose something important at school, how she once walked 3 miles home in the rain because her car had broken down and she didn't want to spend money on a cab if it meant less food on the table that week. And it wasn't just the sacrifices that hit him, it was the consistency, the quiet, unwavering way she showed up, even when he didn't see it, even when he didn't say thank you. And now, sitting alone on the back steps with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped like he was praying to the dusk, he realized that all the growing up he thought he had done had come without the gratitude that makes a man worth knowing, and that every version of success he had built was standing on her shoulders, even though he had refused to acknowledge it. And it was in that space between regret and revelation that he began to truly look at himself, not just the man who had bought a house and secured a career, but the son who had failed to love back with the same strength and patience he had been shown. And he remembered something small. How when he was a teenager he once snapped at her during an argument and slammed his bedroom door, and an hour later he found a note slipped underneath that read, "I still love you. Please come eat when you're ready. Love, Mom." And that memory stung now more than it ever had, because back then he had taken it for granted, had rolled his eyes and stayed in his room out of pride. But now he would give anything to find that note again, to hold it in his hands and whisper the thank you he never said. And as he walked through each moment he had missed or dismissed, he began to understand that redemption wasn't going to come in a single apology. It would come in the work, in the choosing, in the uncomfortable truth-telling and humility that comes when you stop trying to be right and start trying to be real. And so he started small. He cleaned the house not out of duty but out of respect. He sat down and wrote letters, not to send but to practice being honest. And in those letters he confessed everything, how he had felt lost between wanting independence and not knowing how to let her in without feeling like a child, how he had resented the control he imagined she was exerting, only to realize now it wasn't control at all. It was care. It was love wrapped in every ride to school, every meal dropped off, Every unsolicited piece of advice given from a place of history, of knowing, of wanting more for him than he knew how to want for himself. And he began to understand that while he had been searching for his identity outside of her, he had failed to recognize that his foundation, his values, his work ethic, his compassion, all came from her, and by denying her place in his life he had also denied the part of himself that was most worth holding on to. And this awareness wasn't gentle, it was sharp and sobering, and it didn't come with a roadmap, but it came with a question. Could he be brave enough now to go back, to show up not as the son demanding space but as the man asking for grace? And with that question ringing in his ears he stood, the sky dark above him and the porch light casting a soft glow over the garden she had helped him plant. And he made a promise, not just to try but to change, because some apologies come too late, but effort, real effort, can still speak when words have lost their meaning. And he hoped with everything in him that she would still be listening. It took him 3 days to find the courage to dial her number, and even when he did, he stared at the screen long after it began to ring, half hoping she wouldn't answer, half hoping she would. And when her voice finally came through, calm, familiar but unmistakably guarded, he felt his throat tighten around words that had once come easily and now felt like glass in his mouth. And all he could manage at first was her name, just Mom. And it broke something in both of them, not because it was dramatic or loud, but because it had been so long since he'd said it without tension. And in the long pause that followed, she didn't fill the silence like she used to, didn't rescue the conversation or smooth the edges. She just waited. And in that space he realized how much he had always relied on her to do the emotional lifting, to make things easier, and this time it had to be him. So he took a breath and said the only thing that was true: I was wrong. And as the words settled between them, there was no explosion, no immediate absolution, just another pause. And then she said, I know. And he felt tears sting his eyes, because it wasn't an invitation or a door swinging wide open, but it wasn't a closed gate either. It was the first plank on a bridge he had to rebuild one step at a time. And so he asked if she would meet him for coffee, somewhere neutral, somewhere quiet, and she said yes. Not eagerly, not coldly, just yes. And 3 days later they sat across from each other at a small table in the corner of a bakery neither of them had ever been to. And he noticed how different she looked, not older, not harder, but settled, like someone who had reclaimed something precious. And it reminded him of the photos from his childhood where she stood in front of their tiny apartment with her arm around his shoulder and a look of fierce pride in her eyes. And as they spoke there were no grand apologies, just truth laid bare in small sentences, like, I thought pushing you away made me strong. And I never meant to make you feel erased. And each time he admitted something she nodded, not to condone it but to acknowledge it. And he realized that this was what healing looked like, not a perfect return to what had been, but a slow, careful construction of what could be. And she told him about the loneliness, the grief of watching herself become invisible in his life, the betrayal of learning about his relationship with his father not through honesty but through discovery. And though it hurt him to hear, he didn't defend himself, didn't try to reshape the narrative. He just listened, really listened. And when she said, I loved you even when you didn't love me back, something in him cracked open, because he knew it was true. And that kind of love doesn't vanish, but it doesn't forget either. And they talked for over an hour, not just about what had happened but about small things too. How she'd taken up painting again, how he'd started volunteering on weekends, and every moment felt like another brick laid between them. Another step on that fragile bridge neither of them had expected to walk again. And when they said goodbye that day, there was no promise of restoration, but there was a beginning, a hand briefly placed on his shoulder, a soft, take care of yourself. That didn't feel like distance, it felt like hope. And he left knowing that if he wanted to cross the bridge fully, he'd have to keep showing up, not with words but with presence, with consistency. And he was ready to do just that, because for the first time in a long time he understood that the love she had given him wasn't just a safety net. It was a foundation, and he wanted to honor it, not just because he missed her, but because he was ready to become the kind of son who deserved her. It begins not with grand gestures or sweeping pronouncements, because forgiveness is not fireworks. It's the soft kindling of understanding that ignites slowly across the landscape of a broken relationship. And for us, it came in ordinary moments stitched together with intention and care. The first time Ethan showed up at my door with flowers, not expensive ones, just a small bouquet from the corner store, and said with a shy smile, I brought these. And before I could think, I found myself opening the door not out of obligation but out of a beginning. And we stood there for a heartbeat in the hallway that once held tension like a wall between us. And I realized forgiveness wasn't a leap, It was a choice we made over and over, in those quiet spaces between hurt and hope. It showed up when I invited him to dinner one evening, and he showed up not just physically but with a willingness to talk about things he'd never had the courage to say, like how he resented always needing me and how he felt suffocated by love that he didn't yet know how to return. And I listened, not defensively, but with the openness I once reserved only for his childhood fears. And when tears blurred his vision, I reached across the table and squeezed his hand, not with judgment, but with the comforting weight of a mother who knows that sometimes the hardest thing to forgive is yourself. Forgiveness took shape in his volunteer work at the shelter where I used to cook meals, and when he told me, "It's your fault I wanted to do this," I laughed softly through tears because my love had always been contagious, and while I didn't expect him to mimic my path, I was humbled to see it reflected back in his. Proof that the best parts of us persist even after years of silence. It showed up as he helped me repaint the back fence one afternoon, a task I'd put off for months, and as we painted side by side, silence between us felt natural, not awkward, and when he said, "You know, I used to think I'd outgrow this, but I'm glad I didn't," the weight of his words warmed something deep inside me because forgiveness had become mutual, a shared soil tending the fragile shoots of something new. Forgiveness looked like us sharing old photo albums again, not to gloss over pain but to say, "This is our story, messy, hurt, resilient." And when he pointed to a picture of him at 10, his arms draped around me, eyes shining, and said, "I didn't appreciate you then, I do now," I felt something shift, not return but transform, and it showed up in how we spoke. No drama, no grand apologies, but honesty. "I was afraid to ask for your help," he'd say. "I was afraid to expect anything," I'd say back. And those words weren't excuses. They were bricks we placed together on the bridge we'd begun in coffee shops, but now built at home in the daylight, in shared chores and laughter over burned toast and mismatched dinner plates. Forgiveness, I learned, wasn't an ending. It was beginning again, not perfectly but better informed, more intentional, and it often came on days when nothing big happened, like the time he called me midday to say, "Mom, just checking in, how's your day?" And I realized that in those small check-ins he was offering the kind of care he once rejected, and in that moment, I forgave myself for believing his rejection defined me, because here he was, showing up. Forgiveness came not as erasure of the past but as acceptance of it. Like the day I handed him that same casserole dish I'd once carried alone up the stairs, and he took it without hesitation, meeting my eyes and saying simply, "Home," and I knew then that home wasn't just four walls, it was the heart you carried within you if you were willing to come back. Forgiveness, I saw, looked like us sitting on the porch as the sun set, our shoulders brushing, comfortable again, the air between us filled not with things unsaid, but with the gentle hum of a bond rekindled. A bond that had been tested, strained, reshaped but not destroyed. And though we both know forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or pretending nothing happened, or that the phrase "you don't live here anymore" never shattered something, we also know it means choosing connection over pride, growth over guilt, and love over isolation. And so we choose it day by day in imperfect ways, and when I look at him now, I don't see a son who pushed me away. I see a man who found his way back, and when he looks at me he sees not just a mother but a person worthy of being seen, heard, loved, and that is what forgiveness looks like. Two people, wounded but willing, building not what was lost but something stronger. From the pieces that remained, that it didn't happen in one sweeping moment, no final dramatic scene with music swelling or tears perfectly timed to a reunion. It happened slowly, like the turning of a season, like the light that filters through the window just a little earlier each morning. Unnoticed at first until one day you realize the cold has lifted and something tender has returned, and that's what it felt like between us, not a restoration of what was but a rebirth of what could be, something stronger because it had been tested, something deeper because it had once been fractured, and though there were still moments when old wounds ached, when I would hear him raise his voice or I would flinch remembering the echo of those words, "You don't live here anymore," we no longer let those moments define us. Instead, we allowed them to be markers of how far we'd come, of the strength it took to walk through pain without turning bitter, and I watched him begin to rebuild his life, not just his career or relationships, but his inner world, and this time he included me, not out of obligation or guilt but with intention, asking my opinion on things, inviting me into moments, not always big ones but meaningful ones, calling me to ask how to fix a loose cabinet hinge, texting me when he saw something funny that reminded him of a childhood memory, showing up at my door with soup when he heard I had a cold, and those gestures, those seemingly small acts, were to me louder than any apology because they said, I see you, I value you, I want you near, and slowly I stopped bracing myself for rejection, stopped rehearsing exits in my mind whenever I walked into his home, and instead I sat comfortably on his couch, a mug of tea in hand, and told him stories he actually wanted to hear, stories he asked for. And when I looked up and saw the softness in his eyes, the way he leaned in, the way he laughed easily now, I knew we had turned a corner, and that house, the one I once helped him buy and had to fight to be recognized in, no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like a meeting place, a space where both of us had learned how to coexist, not as parent and child, but as equals, as people who chose to care for one another even when it wasn't easy. And I watched him grow into that care, not just with me but with others, becoming the kind of man who made room at his table, who remembered birthdays, who said, I'm sorry without defensiveness and I love you without hesitation. And when we planted a tree together in the backyard last spring, a simple dogwood he picked out because it reminded him of the ones we had outside our first apartment, I knew without a doubt that the roots we were planting now would go deeper than the wounds we once bore, because they were fed by understanding, by the hard work of reconciliation, by the mutual choice to keep coming back to the table even when the past made it difficult. And in that backyard, watching him pat down the soil around the tree, dirt on his hands and sunlight warming his face, he looked up at me and said, "This feels good, doesn't it?" And I nodded, unable to speak because my heart was too full, not with pain or regret or even relief, but with something richer, peace. And as we stood there, side by side, no fences between us anymore, I thought of all the versions of home I had known in my life. The tiny one-bedroom apartment with the leaky faucet where I rocked him to sleep in a thrift store chair, the middle school rental with mismatched furniture and walls covered in his art, the newer condo I downsized to when I thought I was no longer needed, and none of them meant as much to me as this moment, this knowing that we had made it through, not unscathed but unbroken, and that we were choosing each other again as adults, as family, not bound by blood alone but by effort, by forgiveness, by love reclaimed. And I knew then that no matter where we lived or how life changed, we had found our way home, not in the address on a mailbox but in the space between us, now healed, now sacred, now whole.